The screens went red at 2:14 in the afternoon. Every authentication node across Vantage Systems' network began failing simultaneously, cascading, collapsing, folding into each other like dominoes no one had seen coming. 12 engineers crowded the server room. Nobody could find the root file. Nobody understood the architecture well enough to even know where to look. Avery Hart stood at the head of the war room, pulled up the original build log herself, and froze. Deep inside the core module, one author tag. 3 letters, MEC. She cross-referenced the personnel database, hands moving fast, and a file opened. A photo loaded. She recognized the face immediately. The quiet black man from the lobby, the one carrying a small cactus, the one she had watched walk out the door 4 days ago without a single person saying goodbye. Who was this man? And what had they done to him? Marcus Cole had been watching the system for weeks, not because anyone asked him to, not because it was written anywhere in his job description, but because he had built it every layer, every fail-safe, every line of logic threaded through the authentication protocol that kept Vantage Systems running, and he knew what it sounded like when something was beginning to come apart. There were signs. A latency spike at irregular intervals in the overnight logs. A handshake timeout in the secondary node that no one else would have caught unless they understood the architecture from the inside. Marcus noticed. Marcus always noticed. He wrote the report on a Tuesday evening after the floor had emptied out. Methodical detailed the kind of documentation that left nothing to interpretation. He had sent 3 previous versions to Craig Harmon over the preceding 2 months, each one more urgent than the last, each one received in silence. This time he marked it urgent and added the head of IT to the carbon copy. He sent it at 11:47 at night and went home to his daughter. He did not know that 1 hour later, Craig Harmon forwarded that same report to the IT team with Marcus's name stripped from the header. The analysis appeared to come from Craig himself. Marcus saw the forwarded email the next morning in the shared inbox. He stared at the screen. Then he closed the tab and went to make coffee. That was the morning he met Avery Hart. She was 3 days into her role as CEO, and she moved through the 14th floor the way people move through spaces they have already memorized and are now testing against reality. Marcus was in the small kitchen measuring out grounds when she appeared in the doorway. She looked at him the way people look at someone they assume belongs to a category they don't need to investigate. "Which floor is the server room on?" she asked. 11, he said. "Take the east elevator. The west one skips it." She nodded and was already turning to leave. Then she paused. Just one beat, and looked back at him. He couldn't have said why. Neither could she. Then she was gone into the hallway, and Marcus poured his coffee and walked back to his desk. He sat down and opened his top drawer. Inside, folded into quarters, was a small piece of paper Nell had pressed into his hand the evening before. His daughter was 5 years old, and she carried a box of colored pencils the way other children carried stuffed animals. She drew people strangers mostly, and gave the drawings away without explaining why. Yesterday, she had drawn a man standing on top of a tall building holding a star. She had given it to Marcus with the gravity of someone making a significant gift. He had put it in his drawer because he wanted it close. He looked at it for a moment. He thought about Nell. He thought about the permission slip on the refrigerator and the dentist appointment he needed to reschedule, and whether the school would require updated insurance forms if his coverage changed. He did not think about the report. He did not think about his name being removed from it. He folded the drawing, closed the drawer, and started his workday. The termination notice came the following morning. A single sheet of paper, 12 words and 8 years dissolved in one signature. He packed the small cactus he kept beside his monitor, nodded at the HR manager who stood in the doorway, looking at somewhere above his left ear, and walked to the elevator. He crossed the lobby and pushed through the revolving door and stepped out into the gray November light of Chicago. He did not look back. He did not know that Avery Hart was standing at the glass wall of the 14th floor at that exact moment, watching a black man carry a small box through the lobby and disappear into the street. She stood there a moment after he was gone. Then her assistant called her name and she turned back toward the day. Marcus got home at 11 o'clock in the morning. The apartment was quiet in the way apartments are quiet when you are in them. At an hour you are not supposed to be. The refrigerator cycling the building, settling the clock above the stove, marking seconds with no obligation to stop. He had hated that clock since the month after Diane died. It kept going while everything else had stopped, and he had never quite forgiven it. He set the cactus on the kitchen table. He sat on the floor with his back against the refrigerator and did not cry. He just sat. After a while, he got up and opened the side table drawer and took out the envelope he had not looked at in months. Inside was the contract dated March of 2019. 4 pages. The compensation figure on the second page had seemed very large at the time. The author credit line was blank. Under classification of services, rendered consultant work for hire. He remembered the day he signed it. Diane had been diagnosed 4 days earlier. The oncologist had explained the treatment protocol and the costs with the measured calm of someone who has delivered this kind of information before. The deposit required within 72 hours to begin the first treatment phase was a number Marcus did not have. He had called Craig from the hospital parking garage, sitting on the hood of his car in the cold. Craig had offered to buy the system outright, no conditions, no delays. The money in his account before the end of the week. All he needed was a signature. Marcus had not read every line. He had needed Diane to get into treatment before Friday. He signed. He returned the contract to its envelope and the envelope to the drawer. Then he went to the bedroom and took the old work phone from the nightstand battery dead untouched for a year and plugged it into the charger on Nell's dresser. He had never been able to reset that phone. Inside its camera roll were the last photographs she had taken of Diane 3 days before she died at Northwestern Memorial, when afternoon light came through the hospital window at an angle that made everything in the room look gentler than it was. She was smiling in 2 of them. He could not bring himself to wipe the device. Every few months he would charge it, look at the photographs for a few minutes, and return it to the drawer. The emails on that phone, including one from Craig Harmon, sent 2 years after the contract which Marcus had read and filed into the part of himself where things go that you know but are not ready to use, were simply there. A wound healed on the surface and not at all beneath. At 3:15, he walked to Nell's school. She came through the doors at full speed, backpack bouncing, pencil box clutched to her chest. She asked why he was early. He said it was like an early summer. She accepted this and took his hand. After dinner, while she colored at the kitchen table, Marcus opened his laptop and searched for Avery Hart, a Chicago business profile and a LinkedIn page. A profile photo of a woman in a dark teal blazer standing before a large window looking directly at the camera with the expression of someone who had decided something a long time ago and had not wavered since. Nell padded over in her socks and leaned against his arm. She studied the photograph with the focused attention she gave to all potential subjects. Then she went back to her pencil box without a word and began to draw. 20 minutes later, she set the finished drawing in front of him. A woman with dark hair and a teal blazer standing before a window. She had the colors exactly right. "She looks nice," Nell said. It was not a question. Marcus could not find a single thing to say. 4 days after Marcus Cole cleared out his desk, Vantage Systems collapsed. Not physically, not all at once, but the authentication system, every layer of it, every fail-safe, every handshake protocol began to behave exactly as Marcus had warned in 4 separate emails over 2 months that it would behave if the latency issue went unaddressed. The log files began cycling in patterns that should not have been possible under normal conditions. The authentication out at increasing intervals each cycle, slightly worse than the one before it. The error rate climbing without pause toward a threshold that triggered automatic alerts across every department dashboard simultaneously. 12 engineers gathered in the server room and stood in front of screens that told them something was critically wrong without telling them anything about where to begin. The report that explained the failure in precise, actionable detail, Marcus's report forwarded by Craig under a different name 2 months earlier, sat unread in the team's shared inbox because the person who had written it was no longer in the building, And without him, there was no one who understood the architecture well enough to know which paragraph to read first. Craig Harmon called an emergency meeting within the hour. He stood at the front of the conference room with the composure of a man who had rehearsed a version of this moment and believed his preparation had been adequate. He told the assembled department heads that the issue was contained, that his team had identified the root cause, and that full resolution was achievable within 48 hours. He used the word actionable. He used it twice. He did not mention the report. He did not mention the 4 emails. He answered questions from the room and kept his voice at the frequency of someone who is very certain and entirely unafraid. Avery sat at the head of the table and listened without expression. She let him finish. Then she asked a specific technical question about the error handling logic in the authentication module. Craig answered with a generality. She asked about the cascade behavior in the secondary node and the expected propagation rate under current network load. Another generality delivered with slightly less confidence than the first. She asked who had originally designed the core system architecture, and she wrote something down in red ink while he answered that it had been an outside contractor, someone no longer in contact, one of those situations that arises during a company's early growth phase. She set her pen down carefully on the table. She did not look up from the page for 3 full seconds. Craig Harmon had been managing upward for 17 years, and he understood the specific and dangerous language of extended silences. He watched her look at the page and felt something cold and deliberate move through him. "I need the complete personnel record for everyone who worked on the core infrastructure between 2018 and 2022, she said, "and I need legal to pull every consulting contract from that same period. Frame it as a standard internal audit." She closed the notebook. "Both on my desk before end of day." Craig said it seemed like a broad scope for an urgent situation. Avery said she appreciated his perspective. 2 hours later, the personnel list arrived on her desk. She went through every name on it twice. Marcus Cole's name was not there. That night at 10 o'clock, Avery was alone on the 14th floor. The cleaning crew had come and gone. The hallway lights were down to their overnight setting, a dim institutional yellow that made the space feel suspended between a working building and an empty one. She pulled up the system's original repository, the complete version history going back to the first commit 7 years ago. She went to the root files. She went to the metadata. In the author field of the core authentication module, 3 characters blinked back at her from the screen MEC. She opened a second window and went to the United States Patent and Trademark Office database. She entered the patent number she had found embedded in the system's original build documentation, placed there by someone who had wanted a permanent record and had no way of knowing that record would be buried under 6 years of other people's names. The result loaded without delay. Patent number 109125558B, Adaptive Layered Authentication Protocol. Filing date March of 2019. Inventor Marcus Elijah Cole. Licensee Vantage Systems, LLC. She read the name twice. Then she read it a third time. Then she opened the personnel file and found his entry. The photograph loaded. A black man steady-eyed the faintest suggestion of a smile, the kind that does not require an audience. The man from the 14th floor kitchen. The man who had told her to take the east elevator and smiled like it cost him nothing and gone back to his coffee. The man she had watched carry a cactus through the lobby 4 days ago, while 30 people on that floor did not bother to look up from their screens. She sat with his photograph on her monitor and did not look away from it for a long time. And in that time, she thought about what kind of person builds a thing and then watches other people take the credit for it and says nothing for 6 years. She called Craig Harmon at 10:52 at night. One question, no preamble. Was Marcus Cole the person who designed this system? There was a pause on the line, 1 beat longer than any honest hesitation would require. She ended the call. The pause had told her everything she needed. She sat in her car in the parking garage for a long time after that, with her phone in her hand and the city humming somewhere above her through the concrete. She opened LinkedIn and found his profile. No photograph, no biography. Status currently taking time for what matters most. She read it once. She did not close the app immediately. She sat in the dark of the parking structure with the engine off and the windows beginning to fog at their edges and thought about a black man who had invented the system running her company, who had been quietly removed from his own work, who had sent 4 unanswered warnings that it was beginning to fail, and who had walked out of the building with a cactus and no parting words and apparently no intention of making anyone answer for any of it. She thought about the extra second she had spent at the kitchen doorway before turning the corner. She had not understood it then. She still did not entirely understand it now, but differently as something that had a shape and a weight, even if she was not yet ready to give it a name out loud. Before she started the engine, she opened the personnel file one final time and looked at his photograph. Not to confirm anything further. Everything had been confirmed. She just looked. Then she put the phone away and drove home through the November dark. The consulting contracts arrived the following morning in a bound folder from the legal department. Avery set everything else aside and turned directly to March of 2019. 4 pages clean typed the Vantage Systems header at the top. She read through the compensation clause, the scope of services, the intellectual property section. She stopped at the credit line. Author attribution not applicable. Classification of services rendered consultant work for hire. At the bottom of the 4th page was a residential address on the north side of Chicago. She tried the email listed beside it. The message bounced within seconds. She tried the phone number disconnected. He had cut his costs after losing the job. Of course he had. She closed the folder, stood up, took her jacket from the chair back, and walked toward the elevator. Craig intercepted her in the hallway. He had, she noted, positioned himself near enough to the elevator bank that the interception could not have been accidental. He said with the practiced reasonableness of someone who had thought through every word in advance that reaching out to a former employee whose contract had been legally terminated according to proper process could create unfavorable precedent, and that it might be advisable to consult with outside counsel before taking any further steps. He delivered it with the tone of professional concern. But his posture was a half-degree too deliberate, and his eyes were too steady in the way eyes get when a person is concentrating very hard on appearing at ease, and Avery had spent enough years in rooms with people who had things to protect to know the difference between advice and management. She looked at him for exactly 1 second. "Thank you for your concern," she said. She walked past him. In that moment, the unremarkable act of her continuing to move, Craig understood that he had made an error. A VP of engineering does not have a specific and urgent opinion about which former consultants a CEO chooses to contact unless he has a specific and urgent reason for wanting that person kept away. He had shown her the shape of what he was protecting. He stood in the hallway and watched the elevator doors close in front of him. The address was still current. Marcus had not moved. He had stayed because Nell's school was 6 blocks away, because Diane's mother lived nearby, and because it was the school Diane had always said she wanted for their children, back when she was still saying things like that. Avery drove north through the afternoon traffic, parked on the side street, walked up to the front door of a building with a small concrete stoop and a potted plant beside the entrance that had managed against reasonable November odds to still be alive. She knocked. She waited. Movement inside the unhurried approach of someone interrupted mid-task who is coming without rushing. The door opened. They looked at each other across the threshold. A dish towel was tucked into his apron strings. He was holding a cast-iron pan, his dark hands steady around the handle. Behind him from the kitchen, the sound of a small person coloring. A moment passed between them, one of those moments that has a weight and a shape, but not yet a name. Then she said, "I need to talk to you." And he turned toward the kitchen and said, "Nell, go ahead and eat, sweetheart." They went out to the small landing at the top of the exterior stairs. The November wind off Lake Michigan was direct and cold. Avery had her hands in her jacket pockets. Marcus leaned against the railing with his arms folded and waited. She asked him directly, with no preamble, why had he signed the contract the way he had signed it? Why had he left the author credit blank and said nothing for 6 years? He told her about Diane, not the photographs, Not the way the light had come through the hospital window on the last good afternoon, but enough. The diagnosis, the 72 hours, the parking garage, and Craig picking up on the second ring with an offer and no conditions. He had not read the intellectual property clause carefully because he had been thinking about one thing, and the contract was not it. I needed her to get into treatment before Friday, he said. That was the only fact I was working with. She listened without filling the silence. He went inside and returned with the old phone. He had been carrying it in his jacket pocket without fully understanding why the way you carry things that have weight you are not yet ready to put down. He unlocked it, opened the email, and held it out to her without explanation. She read it. Craig Harmon, 2021, the year the system went fully live across the company. The message was 4 lines. Best not to bring any of this up with anyone. Everything had been handled. She read it twice, then looked up. You kept this for 5 years, she said, and you never used it. I kept the phone because of the photographs Marcus said of Diane. I couldn't reset it. A pause. The email was just something that was there every time I opened it, like something you know but don't want to carry around. She was quiet. There was nothing adequate to say, and she was perceptive enough not to try. Why didn't you tell anyone, she asked. He turned to look through the kitchen window. Nell had finished eating and was at the counter now, pressing a drawing against the refrigerator door with a piece of tape tongue out the side of her mouth while she worked to get it straight. The drawing went up slightly crooked. She frowned at it, peeled it back, repositioned it, stepped away to assess. Satisfied, she went back to the table. Because I was too busy being a dad to be a hero, Marcus said quietly. The way you say the facts that are the most true without emphasis, without performance. Avery looked where he was looking. She saw the drawing on the refrigerator. She saw the cactus on the kitchen table, the permission slip under a magnet near the door, the dish towel still hanging from his apron strings. She saw the whole shape of a life held together by a person who had decided at some specific moment of grief that the only thing worth holding on to was the small human who needed him to keep standing. Something in her shifted, not a professional recalibration, not a weighing of information, something older than that and less manageable. The front door opened and Nell appeared with her pencil box and walked directly to Avery with the certainty of a child who has already made a decision and is simply executing it. She held out a folded piece of paper. Avery unfolded it carefully. The woman with dark hair, the teal blazer, the large window behind her. Nell had drawn this person 3 nights ago from her father's laptop screen and had been waiting with patient 5-year-old purpose for the chance to deliver it directly to its subject. I drew you from the picture on Dad's computer, Nell said. Avery looked at the drawing. She looked at Marcus. He was looking at the railing, and his ears had gone slightly red beneath his dark skin. She does this, he said, draws strangers. I don't mind, Avery said. She folded the drawing once carefully and placed it in the interior pocket of her jacket, the one on the left side nearest to where a person's heart would be if you were measuring. She drove back through the city with one hand on the wheel and the drawing folded against her chest. That night she compiled everything, the patent, the commit log, the contract, Craig's 2021 email, and sent it to the legal department with a cover note requesting an independent assessment of the 2019 agreement and all personnel decisions that had followed it. She sent the email, made tea, and sat by the window overlooking Lake Michigan. She had paid a decade of long days to be able to look out that window. Tonight the lake was dark, and the city lights lay on its surface, and she could not stop thinking about a sentence she had heard on a back porch in November. At 2 minutes past 2 in the morning, her phone lit up. An email from a personal address, no subject line. She opened it. 8 pages of technical documentation, precise, exhaustive, organized with the clarity of someone who had been carrying this problem in his mind for a long time. The location of the system failure, the error in the secondary node, the cascade it was generating. The exact sequence of patches required in order of priority with estimated resolution times for each step. At the bottom of the last page below the final technical line was a single sentence of plain text. Not for the board, just because it needs to be fixed. She read that sentence 3 times. She set the phone face down on the table and looked out at the lake, large, dark, indifferent to the buildings along its edge. She thought about a black man who had just been fired from the company he had built, who had been systematically removed from his own work, who had walked out with a cactus and no scene, and who had sat down at his kitchen table at some hour after his daughter fell asleep, and spent the next several hours writing a document no one had asked for which he would not be compensated, addressed to the company that had let him go because a system was broken, and the fact of its being broken was simply not something he could leave alone. There are people who do the right thing when someone is watching. There are people who do it when they have calculated, consciously or not, that it will eventually serve them. And then there are people who do it at 2 o'clock in the morning in an empty apartment with no audience and no expectation of anything in return, simply because the thing is broken, and leaving it broken is not something they can live with. Avery had grown up believing she was that third kind of person. Somewhere in a decade of managed impressions and carefully calibrated presentations, she had lost track of whether it was still true or whether she had gradually become someone who only did the right thing when the context made it convenient. Tonight, sitting by the window with a cup of tea gone cold, she wanted to find out again. Before her calendar started the next morning, she opened his email and read the last line one more time. Then she put the phone in her pocket and walked into the building. Craig Harmon had not spent the night waiting passively. 2 board members had received calls from him the previous evening, carefully framed calls suggesting that Avery was perhaps allowing emotion to distort her judgment and that her relative inexperience with the technology sector might warrant the board's attention. He had chosen the 2 members he assessed as most susceptible. He had been wrong about one of them. The head of legal called Avery at 8:15 to report the contacts. She thanked him, asked him to document everything, and told her assistant to schedule an emergency board meeting for 11 o'clock. At 10:45, before she walked into the boardroom, she took the phone from her pocket and opened his email one final time. She read the last line, then she put the phone away, straightened her jacket, and walked in. She laid out the case without theatrics. The patent, the commit log with the MEC author tag, the 2019 contract with the blank credit line. Craig's 2021 email projected on the screen at full size so that every person in the room could read it without assistance. The 4 unanswered warnings, each more urgent than the last, all sent before the crash, all forwarded to other recipients under a name that was not the name of the person who had written them. And then the last piece, she described the document that had arrived in her personal inbox at 2 o'clock in the morning. She read the final line aloud. Not for the board, just because it needs to be fixed, and let the room hold it in silence. 2 board members raised the legal defense as Craig had prepared them to. The contract was valid. The termination had followed proper process. There was no actionable breach. Avery did not contest the legal ground. "You're right that it was legal," she said. "I'm asking whether it was right, and whether we are the kind of company that makes that distinction." She looked around the table. "This man sent us a complete technical solution at 2 o'clock in the morning after we fired him. He wasn't asked. He won't be compensated. I want to know if this board is prepared to acknowledge what that means." The chairman asked whether it was possible to contact Mr. Cole. "I've already been in contact with him," Avery said. "The question is whether we deserve to be." The vote was 6-1. Craig Harmon was suspended pending internal investigation effective immediately. The 2 members he had lobbied cast abstentions. They could not bring themselves to vote in his favor after hearing that sentence read aloud by a woman who clearly understood exactly what it meant, but they were also not yet ready to fully account for what their years of incurious governance had quietly made possible. The investigation would begin within 48 hours. The room cleared without much conversation. Avery drove to Nell's school that afternoon. She spotted Marcus from across the street, a tall black man standing at the gate with a paper bag jacket not quite heavy enough for November breath, making small clouds in the cold. He looked up when she crossed toward him. He did not look surprised, and she was glad of it. "The board wants to meet with you," she said. "What for?" he asked. "To make it right." Before he could respond, the school doors opened and Nell came through at full speed, backpack swinging pencil box pressed to her chest, and launched herself at her father with the total trust of a child who has never once been dropped. He caught her with one arm, the book still in his other hand. Then Nell spotted Avery, and her face changed into the expression of someone who has been expecting a specific thing and is watching it arrive. "You're the lady from my drawing?" Nell said. Avery crouched to her level. "I am, and you draw very well." Nell received this as accurate, nodded once with the authority of someone confirming a fact they already knew, and tucked her face back against her father's shoulder. The day Marcus walked back into Vantage Systems, he brought his old laptop scuffed at the corners, a small blue star sticker on the lid that Nell had applied one morning while he was making breakfast, and that he had decided not to remove. Inside was everything. The original design files, the first commit, with its timestamp intact, the full chain of technical correspondence from the development period. He had not brought it to make a case. The case had already been made. He brought it because the board would have questions and the system was still broken, and he intended to answer precisely and fix what needed fixing. He sat in the waiting area outside the boardroom and went through the files one more time, not rehearsing making certain of the details before he was asked about them in the manner of a person who has spent a long time being the one in any room who understood what he was looking at. They called him in. He sat at the long table across from 7 people who had recently learned something about the company they governed that they had not previously known, and he talked for 11 minutes. He described the failure, precisely its location in the secondary node, its origin in the latency issue he had flagged 4 times the cascade it had produced, and the specific sequence of patches required in what order and why each step mattered before the next. He was not performing and he was not angry. He was a person explaining something he understood completely to people who needed to understand it adequately. The 7 board members did not interrupt him once. When he finished, he closed the laptop and sat back. The chairman said, "We owe you an apology, Mr. Cole." Marcus nodded once. He did not say it was all right. He did not perform gratitude for words that were, however well-intentioned, a small thing relative to what they were for. He had not come for the apology. He stood up. Avery caught him in the hallway. She held out an envelope. He took it and opened it and read every line, this time fully to the last page, with no 72-hour deadline pressing on him from every direction. A long-term consulting contract, his name in the author credit field, the patent number cited correctly, compensation at double his last salary. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I did it." He looked at her then directly and fully, without the reflexive looking away he had practiced since Diane died, and solitude had become the structure around which he organized everything else. Why, he asked, not about the contract, about all of it. She held his gaze. "Because there are things that are right that need doing," she said. "You showed me that." At 2 o'clock in the morning, the elevator doors opened. They stepped in together. The doors closed. In the brief contained quiet of that small moving room, the building above and the city below, and nothing between them but 3 feet of space and the soft yellow overhead light. He said her name for the first time. Not Miss Hart, not you. Just her name, the way you say something you have been thinking about for a while and are finally ready to say out loud. "Thank you, Avery." She was looking straight ahead at the closed doors. The corner of her mouth moved just slightly, just enough for him to see if he was paying the kind of attention he was paying. He was paying attention. 6 weeks later, Craig Harmon resigned without appeal 3 days after the internal investigation concluded its findings and presented them to the full board. He did not contest anything. The authentication system had been fully restored in 14 days, exactly as fast as the document sent at 2 o'clock in the morning had predicted, not a day more. Marcus's name appeared on Vantage Systems' technical documentation for the first time. The patent record was corrected to reflect the actual inventor. 300 people logged in every morning, and the system worked quietly and without interruption the way things work when they have been built correctly by someone who understood what they were building. Avery came to the small office Marcus had rented near the lakeshore on a Wednesday in December. She brought coffee, black, no sugar, the kind he had been making in the 14th floor kitchen on the morning she walked in, and assumed he belonged to a category she didn't need to think about. She had remembered from a single brief observation the way she remembered things that mattered before she had words for why they mattered. He did not ask how she knew. He poured it into a mug, and they sat at the table by the window. Outside Lake Michigan in December was a particular cold gray, not beautiful the way the lake is in summer, but not without its own austere and honest quality. They talked about the new system architecture he was designing. They talked about Nell, who had recently decided to draw exclusively in blue for an undetermined period and was still working out her reasons. They talked about Duluth, where Avery had grown up and not returned to since the August she turned 18, and drove south with everything she owned in a second-hand car with one working window. She had not told that story to anyone in a long time. Marcus listened the way he listened to everything without rushing to respond, without filling the available space with noise, without redirecting toward himself. He just listened. Avery found herself saying more than she had planned, and found that she did not want to stop. The December light moved slowly across the table between them. Neither of them reached for a lamp. On the refrigerator at home, held in place by a moon-shaped magnet between a school calendar and a photograph of Diane taken in summer light 10 years ago. Nell's drawing was still there. The woman in the teal blazer, the dark hair, the forward gaze. At the bottom in the large, uneven letters of a child still learning that the lines don't have to be perfect to say exactly what you mean, written in red pencil, Miss Avery, the lady Dad, looks at. Every morning before he made coffee, Marcus looked at that drawing, and every morning he thought about whether there was a good reason to be on the north side of the city that day. There usually was, and on the days there wasn't, he made one.